Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Governance and Leadership Podcast. Today, we're going to walk you through the Governance and Leadership Self-Assessment. We're going to talk through what's required for your submission and offer some useful hints and tips on what to look for when completing your self-assessment. My name is Yvonne Thorogood. I'm the Quality and Development Officer here at Homestart UK. And with me, I have Steve Griffiths, who's the Quality Specialist.
Hello, everyone. Nice to speak with you again.
Today's podcast will be split into 4 different questions. Question 1 is, what do the quality team look for when evaluating a submission? Question 2, what is different about the governance and leadership submission from the protecting families submission? Question 3, what are the key indicators you'll be looking at in this standard? And question 4, what are your tips for completing the submission? So moving on to the first question, Steve, could you tell us what the quality team look for when evaluating a governance and leadership submission?
Yes, of course, Yvonne. So I think there are 3 main things that we look for in the quality team. The first will be that there's sufficient detail in the narrative of your self-assessment that clearly covers what an indicator is asking for. So if we look at the indicator GAL004, for example, it's actually asking for 2 things. First of all, what your process is for appraising the performance of individual trustees. And secondly, what's your process for reviewing the effectiveness of your board as a whole? So in your narrative, we would expect to see that you've covered both of those elements of the indicator and that you've self-assessed against both of those. The second thing we look for is that what you actually say in your narrative and how you self-assess. So if you say, for example, that you're fully met or partially met or not met, that's supported by any evidence. So if we look at the indicator GAL003, for example, so this is around trustee eligibility declarations. So this actually, the evidence for this one, you will have covered in the Protecting Families submission because it's part of the trustee file audit that you look at. So what we would have expected for this is when you self-assess against this indicator, you will have taken into consideration the findings of your trustee file audit and that your self-assessment reflects that. So when you did your file audits, if the trustee files you sampled all had eligibility declarations in place that were in date, then you would be able to confidently self-assess as fully met. And the third thing that we look at is that your self-assessment is honest. So we know that, things change in all organizations, and sometimes we're not able to fully meet all of the indicators, and that is absolutely fine. So for instance, if we were to look at the indicator GAL009, which is about having trustees in the various different roles of chair, safeguarding lead, information governance lead, etc. We all know that sometimes trustees step down and leave, and that leaves organizations with a gap while they either recruit new trustees or ask another trustee to step into that role. Your submission is a snapshot in time. So if you do have gaps in those roles at the moment, that's absolutely fine. So you would self-assess as part met in that case. And what we would then look for is that you've got a clear action in place about how you're going to meet that indicator. So that would be an action with a date attached to it. So they're the main three things that we look at in all submissions, Yvonne.
That's perfect. Thank you, Steve. So what is different about the governance and leadership submission from the protecting families submission?
So the first thing you'll notice about the governance and leadership standard is that there are far more indicators in this standard than there were in the protecting families, which only had 3 indicators. The other thing you will notice is that these standards have different status. So some of these indicators are musts, which are the ones in grey. Some are shoulds, which are the ones in pink. And at the very end, you've got an indicator which is in light blue, which is the HSQA12. So whereas in the protecting families standard, there were 3 indicators and they were all musts. Secondly, we're actually asking you for far less documentary evidence to be uploaded with your submission in comparison to the protecting families submission. So this is the at-home page, which is the guidance on this submission. And you will see if we scroll down, the only thing that we're actually asking you to upload this time is the latest minute of your trustee board. That's what we're asking you to upload. So just one piece of evidence. And there is another indicator which asks around whether you've reviewed and updated your governing documents in line with the handbook requirements. And that's also covered on this page. So if you have done that, you can also upload your reviewed and updated governing document, but that's not a necessity. It's only if you've already done that. And we'll look at that a bit more when I look at the individual indicators with you. So for this submission, we're going to be heavily reliant on the narrative that you put in your self-assessment, and also where you self-assess as not fully met, we will be looking for what improvement actions you have in place to be able to meet the indicators. So they're the main differences, Yvonne.
Thanks, Steve. So moving on to question 3, what are the key indicators that you'll be looking at in this standard?
So as there's quite a lot of indicators in this standard, today I'm just going to mainly focus on the must indicators, so the ones in grey, but I will cover a couple of the shoulds as well. So if we start from the top, GAL 001. So this is really the fundamental indicator that actually your Home Start is operating in line with its governing document. And for those of you that are incorporated, that will be your memorandum and articles of association. And that's going to cover things like how many trustees should you have. It might cover what the maximum of number of trustees are. It will cover what is the quorum for board meetings and the powers that trustees have as well. And they will all be outlined in your governing document.
So if we take a look at GAL 002 now, because there is a change in this from what is written in the indicator. The deadline of June 2023 has been extended to September 2025. So if we look at the Home Start Handbook, the actual review of your governing documents is against the bullet points on page 65. There are 7 key requirements we're asking Home Start's governing documents to ensure that they cover. The main material change is that there should be a stated length of term that trustees can serve on the board.
So Yvonne, if we could now go back to the indicators, please. So looking at Gale 003, when you self-assess against this, you can look at the evidence that you found in your protected families submission, because the trustee file audits cover trustee eligibility declarations. This is very much one of those indicators that is really either a yes, no, or part met, because you're actually you want to have all of these things, all of the declarations in place for each trustee. So you will either have those in place or you might have a gap. And if there are a gap, then please put that in your narrative and put an action and a date by which you will be able to close that gap and meet the requirement. For GAL 004, which we discussed in the earlier question, so when you're self-assessing against this, just make sure you self-assess against both elements of that indicator, and that you know, if you were asked, would you have evidence of individual trustee performance, and would you have evidence for a review of the whole board's effectiveness? Again, looking at GAL 005, this you will have evidence again from your protecting families submission, because it's around trustees training on safeguarding, both as part of their induction, but also an annual update, and that you will have, again, through your trustee file audit and your safeguarding checklist that you did for the protecting families self-assessment, know where you are up to in meeting that particular indicator. Looking at GAL 006, again, this is a very straightforward indicator, which will either be yes or no, because it's about, do you have a trustee that has lead responsibility for safeguarding? And again, you can refer back to your protecting families submission for that one. GAL 007. So when you're self-assessing against this one, you would be looking at your records on At Home and making sure that your active trustees are all registered on At Home. And if they are, then you can be fully met on that one. For GAL 008, so this is really looking at one of the main responsibilities of a trustee board, which is leading the strategy and looking at the strategic direction of the local Home Start. And we'll be using the board minute that we've asked you to upload as evidence for this particular indicator. And we'll be looking at the sort of standard agenda items you cover in your board minutes, and what we can see minuted about the elements covered in GAL 008. So GAL 009 is very similar to 005. It's, again, it will either be a yes or no or a part for this one, because you will either have trustees appointed to the roles outlined in this indicator, or as we discussed earlier, if somebody's recently stepped down, you may have a gap. That's fine, as long as there's a clear action about how you're going to address that, if that's the case. GAL 0010. So this is really looking at your compliance with the requirements of the Charity Commission or your regulator relevant to your nation, and if you're incorporated, the requirements of Companies House. So one of the key things with this are, have you lodged your annual returns and accounts on time? And are you aware of any requirements for reporting that you have to do to the regulator? And do you make those reports on time where you're required? So they're the types of things you would take into consideration when looking at that particular indicator and self-assessing against it. And really that's very similar to GAL 011, which is really, if you're incorporated, just make it self-assessing that you are compliant with the key requirements of company law. So they're all the must requirements, which we will be looking at in detail when we go through the submission. So the rest of the indicators in this standard are shoulds. So these are things that if you're not able to say you currently meet those at the moment, then it's around having a continuous improvement plan in place to enable you to meet those indicators. I'd just like to look at GAL 012 because this is very similar to GAL 002. This is around submitting your governing document to us. So for this submission, if you've actually reviewed and updated your governing document in line with the requirements that we looked at in the handbook, it would be helpful if you could submit that to us. But if you're waiting on HSUK to publish the finalized versions of the new model governing documents, it's absolutely fine just to self-assess this as part met, and that you will be carrying out the review against the model documents. And we don't need you to submit your current governing documents. And again, if we look at GAL 015, so this indicator actually asks you to submit these things, these various documents. You don't need to do that for this submission. If you have all of those different documents and processes in place, you can just self-assess as met and say that you would submit these when your local Home Star is subject to the full quality review. So we don't need you to submit these documents for this particular submission. So that's really the answer to that third question, Yvonne. Was that all clear, or is there anything you wanted me to clarify?
That's perfect. Thank you. Thanks for talking us through all of that, all of those questions there, Steve. Have you got any hints and tips for the network, or best ways of going through this governance and leadership submission?
So first of all, given this is about governance and leadership, we would expect that obviously the trustees are involved in this self-assessment, because many of the indicators here relate to the responsibility of the trustees of your organisation. So they should be involved in the self-assessment and signing off the submission. Secondly, just make sure that your narrative in the self-assessment web form is clear and it's sufficiently detailed to support how you have self-assessed against each indicator. Now, in some of those indicators, the narrative won't need to be long because they will either be yes, no, or part answers, whereas in other indicators, you will need to put more narrative in to explain your self-assessment against them. And if you are self-assessing as either part met or not met, then just make sure there's clear actions with timescales in your self-assessment so that we know as the quality team that you've identified this and that you have a plan in place on how you're going to meet the requirements of each indicator. Secondly, I think make sure your self-assessment covers all elements of an indicator, and we talked about that in the very first question. Please make sure that you complete all of the indicators in the web form. So all the way through from GAL 001 through to 016, plus the indicator HSQA 12, because one of the things we look for is the thoroughness of the self-assessment and that you have self-assessed against each indicator. And finally, just make sure you also upload your most recent trustee board minute, because that's the key documentary evidence that we're asking you to submit. They are my main tips, Yvonne.
Fantastic. And yeah, so if anybody's got any questions around the governance and leadership self-assessment, it's best to contact the quality team via email and quality@home-start.org.uk. And I'll also pop that email address on the screen for you now. And one of the team can pick up an email from you or arrange a call with you, and we're happy to just sit and chat through any questions that you've got that we haven't covered in today's podcast.
I hope that your self-assessments go well, and just remember that the deadline for this submission is the 31st of October, and we look forward to receiving them. Thank you very much for listening and your time.